Bubblegum Crisis. One of the more well-animated animes of the 80s, mostly because it was an OVA. Less episodes meant that there was more time to focus specifically on the episodes that you were putting out. The downside there was that the time in which it took to get those episodes out really took some time. Like almost 5 years to put out 8 episodes? Yeah, but you couldn't argue with the quality. That was the thing. That was the defining thing about this kind of stuff. And while the Bubblegum Crisis series as a whole had its more 80s friendly, macho-esque showings like AD Police Files or Parasite Dolls, stuff like that, it was always Bubblegum Crisis that really stood out, specifically because of the fact that you had these fairly young women, late teens, early 20s, working women, who by day would be the socialites and office workers and so on and so forth, and by night they don these exosuits and go on and take down rogue robots who serve the people. Honestly, very reminiscent of Mega Man X with the Mavericks. You'd have robots that would serve the people, and every once in a while they'd have this kind of virus programming, and they'd go rogue and just terrorize the streets. And then, because the police force known as the AD Police had a tendency to get a little overwhelmed with these rogue robots called, of all things, boomers, which, that's a whole thing in and of itself. But Bubblegum Crisis really did have its own cult following going on because of the lovability of the main characters and just the overall style that it presented. The premise, not overly complex, but each episode had a tendency to kind of build on itself as it went along. But it was the main characters who really stood out. You had Celia Stingray, who was kind of the Leonardo of the group, called the Night Sabers. You know, a very well-to-do woman who owns several businesses, and she's the financier of the team, as well as one of the, Night Sabers herself. Although she didn't always go out to fight, but she was there on the front lines a lot of times with her group. Very stylish, cool, always composed. I was a businesswoman through and through. Celia Stingray was the Leonardo. All business, no nonsense, but could have fun from time to time when the time called for it. On the flip side, you had the Raphael, named Priscilla Asagiri. Asagiri? Yeah, Asagiri. The super cool character of the series. Because she was voiced by an actual singer, she'd be in like bands and stuff and like sing the theme song. She rode on motorcycles and stuff, or at least I think in the original series she did. Sometimes her personality kind of gets overwritten by with her later incarnation, but it was the 80s, and the 80s always had these music video-esque moments. And Pris really was the forefront for those moments. But Pris could be moody and very rebellious, like definitely a product of the late 80s, early 90s movement of like punk and rock, and the outfits that she wore were very stylish for the time, whereas Celia wore a lot of dresses and jewelry and makeup. Pris was always about that punk outfits and styles and all that good stuff. Like, really, she was the cultural icon of the time. Pris was definitely a fan favorite of this series. And then you have Lina Yamazaki, who was kind of the every girl of the group. Kind of like the Winston of the group if you were going by Ghostbusters logic. She serves as more of the heart of the group. Although she does have this love for money, she is a very down-to-earth person. And I very much felt like she was the character who was kind of brought in to be the average person who, asks questions or, just sees the world for what it is. Kind of keeps the whole group honest for the most part. And then last but not least, you have Nini Romanova, who, while I was trying to make a lot of TMNT analogs, she's kind of a blend between like Michelangelo and Donatello. Bubbly, kind of naive, eats a lot of junk food, but also a very competent hacker on top of that, which really was her selling point. And making it so that she had so much utility, what could have easily been a kind of annoying character ends up being one of the more useful characters because she's able to do all the technical know-how. She also is an employee of the AD police, so whenever something is going on that the AD police get wind of, she's there and in the know. So she ends up with a lot of screen time, despite the fact that she's one of the more minor characters of the group as a whole. And for Bubblegum Crisis on a whole, despite the fact that it was actually originally planned for 13 episodes but was cut down to 8, it still really got this cult following. There were a lot of behind-the-scenes issues that came about, which really is a shame because there was a lot of good stuff in the series. The series kind of tried to come back and do its finale with Bubblegum Crash, but then those same legal issues came back again and completely sidelined things as once more. So even Bubblegum Crash never reached a proper conclusion, and the series would kind of be put on hold for almost 10 years. As the original series went into like this indefinite hiatus, and we never reached a proper conclusion, but for the most part, you got most of what you could have hoped for out of the series. But then it came back several years later in the form of Bubblegum Crisis Tokyo 2040. However, whereas the original Bubblegum Crisis was definitely a through and through example of the 80s. Like, everything about that original series screams 80s, late 80s to be more specific. Everything about the newer Bubblegum Crisis, the retelling of the OVAs, Tokyo 2040, it just screams late 90s. Because the action is a lot more intense, there's a lot more drama driven in each of the characters, their personalities are definitely a lot more fleshed out in regards to their hobbies, their downtime, their struggles, all that stuff. But this series also had 26 episodes to go about, so there was nothing kind of left on the cutting room floor when it came to this. In this series, Pris is definitely placed a lot further towards the forefront of things, as because she's the rebellious loner who is always going off on her own. She lives in the slums, she plays on a rock band, she's got the anger issues. It is 90s to the max. And she has this gritty past where she lost her boyfriend and he was killed and she wanted revenge, and that's how she ended up in the Night Sabers. And a lot of her centralized stories have a lot of tragedy to them, but she has a good heart. She's prickly on the outside, but has a sweetness on the inside that's rarely found from time to time. Like, she really was the Wolverine of the group. I can't stop making analogies, but honestly, there were these just caricatures of these archetypes during the 90s that you always saw in ensemble series. You always kind of saw them. Lena, instead of being with the Night Sabers from the onset, was actually made into this farm girl from out in the sticks who had come to the big city, but then she had to deal, with an office job that had all these sexual harassment situations, like very much a commentary on the office place mishandlings and stuff like that kind of nature. So Lena joining the Night Sabers kind of becomes this, like, I'm trying to break out of the mundane life I've had up until this point to gain some form of control over my life, to really show that I'm not just another person, a face in the crowd. It's like she's vying for this relevance, and she kind of butts heads with Pris, not so much because they're enemies or anything like that, but she's just driven to be the best of the best and outdo Pris, kind of. And it's a nice little rivalry they kind of have going. A little bit one-sided, but at the same time it gives Lena a lot more agency in terms of the group dynamic. With Celia, whereas Celia in the original series could come off as a lot more aloof, and while that is true for this version of Celia, Celia here is a lot more tortured, as she has a lot more of a relation to the boomers, and she took it upon herself to find a way to take them down, because she feels like there's more of a personal stake in it because of her involvement with their creation. But because of, like, she's given this tortured past where she has these flashbacks, and she'll wake up in a sweat or panting hard, because, of course, you gotta make her tortured. You gotta give her a little bit more agency, a little bit more involvement. But she doesn't always get involved with a lot of the action like the original Celia did, which was very different. But she suffers from a lot of PTSD, and her, starting to become more of an active participant in the series is kind of like a character point for her for the most part. Meanwhile, for Nini, nothing really changes that much for her character. They kind of downplay a lot of the more bubbly aspects of her character, making her less of a like adult child and more just naive. She's still an adept hacker, she's still involved with the AD, police and all that stuff, but I feel like they kind of undermined her character a little bit more in terms of this series. She's not as at the forefront of things as she was in the other series, because I guess they felt like they wanted to kind of downplay a lot of the more quirky aspects of her personality, which makes it so that she doesn't stand out as much in this version of the series, which is kind of unfortunate. They took away the comedy relief for the most part, and in order to make the series a lot more serious and down to earth, which, should be fine. She's seen as the bubbly kind of ditz for the most part, but that can have both its positives and negatives. I don't know, it just feels like she doesn't shine as much as she originally did in this series, and I feel like that's a bit of a shame. But, both series are good, both solid depictions of these women who go out, do their job, and they do it well. They kick ass, they take names, and they do it all with style. Bubblegum Crisis is definitely a series that I would love to see have a newer interpretation in today's market, to see how well it does, just because it would be a shame to have this franchise just fade away for the most part and just not be relevant anymore in today's world. It's a series that definitely deserves to be remembered. But don't just take it from me, let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. Do you remember Bubblegum Crisis? Which was your favorite series? The original, or were you more of a fan of the remake? I'm definitely interested to hear from you, and if you liked this video, please like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for notifications. And until next time, I've been Duuz-Diz-Din, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.